All right, what's up, guys? I hope you're doing well. So basically, one of the things that I've been having trouble with kind of conceptualizing in a way is like what exactly is happening during a repo transaction. Um, for some reason, it just didn't click for a minute, and so I thought I'd make a post about literally going step by step to and like seeing like, okay, cash here, what happens? Collateral here, what happens? Just so I could, one, to help me understand it better, because that's pretty much how I think is it's very literal and like that's how I got through my whole physics degree was literally like draw a picture, this happens, what happens over here, why is that happening, and like literally step by step and trying to break it down into as fundamental as you can get, to really understand what's going on. So that being said, we will head straight over to the screen share and figure this out. Boom. Okay. And so basically what I did specifically was I kind of used a case study. So technically it's not 100% true in a way. Um, Basically I used with the examples of the Federal Reserve and the commercial banks for multiple reasons. One of them being the cash involved is bank reserves because the commercial banks have reserve accounts at the Fed. Um, and there are multiple other types of repos with different entities. There's money market funds, hedge funds. There's a bunch of other things, right? So, and specifically using this diagram too, this is a diagram of bilateral repo. I just picked that because one, it's less kind of, or it's more compact than tri-party repo. And I'm pretty much the whole point of this post is just concepts. Like, what's the concept of what's happening? And with the tri-party repo, it's basically like, okay, there's a clearinghouse, and this all happens on their between the two respective entities' accounts at that clearinghouse, and so on. Just the picture for the bilateral one's easier to conceptualize. Literally, just like it cuts out the middleman. Um, Even though bilateral repo isn't the majority for transactions, tri-party is, and there are some different little like technicalities that between the two and how they change, which we'll get into in a minute with the rehypothecation and stuff like that. Um, but yeah, I just want to use that. Just this is I basically did this just for pure concept, what's happening during a general repo transaction, in terms of like, okay, cash goes here for funding, and then collateral goes here. What can happen from that? Because you can think about this from multiple points of view. So again, you basically have two beginning and ending entities. You have the cash investor and the collateral provider. And I'm using U.S. Treasuries, one, to keep it consistent with the graphic, and two, with the Federal Reserve itself, it just kind of seemed more natural, even though there are more, they do use other forms of collateral like agency securities and mortgage-backed securities and other things. Um, for repo, I just decided to just pick one, U.S. Treasuries. It happened to be with the graphic, and also with all the quantitative easing and everything else that's no longer happening at the moment. We'll see what happens, um, because who knows. But yeah. Anyways, so basically, for the opening, oh, I should probably say this beforehand. And if you don't understand, like if this is like the first repo related video or post you're reading from me, I did link. I'll point it out at the bottom. I believe it's this one, the middle one, where I have going more in general of what an actual like repo transaction is, like the types of the different characteristics. So, like, what is a haircut for the repo transactions? Okay, how exactly is interest paid? Because it's technically not like repos. I think are kind of weird because they're technically not collateralized loans, but they act as such. Um, they're called repurchase agreements, and so that interest that I'm going to be talking about isn't like interest paying on a regular loan. It's like, they basically like they bid the prices, and so one in this cash investor initially purchases the treasuries from the collateral provider. As we can see here, cash flows from cash investor to collateral provider. And you know what? I'm just going to I don't want to get too far ahead of myself and kind of get on a little. I'm kind of running parallel to the center argument of the blog anyway. And so let me just retrace and step by step. That's the whole point of the post. Okay, so in this case, the Fed with a repo transaction with a regular repo, the Fed buys a security from a commercial bank. Again, just the specific entities I'm choosing for this example. So therefore, for a regular repo, the Fed plays the role as the cash investor. They give, in this terms, bank reserves, we'll say 9 million with the graphic, to the collateral provider, who would be the commercial bank, who then gives 10 million in US treasuries to the cash investor. This difference is the haircut, which I go into in that other post. Just basically discounting the collateral. So in terms of like risk and everything else, because this is a short-term funding market, so you have to keep that in mind. And I go a little bit more in depth in there. I just don't want to make the video too long, because there's no point. It's already out there. Okay, and so basically, yeah, U.S. Treasuries are used as pristine collateral, which is why I chose them for one. Okay, so this is the opening of the repo transaction, and so you have bank reserves from the Fed were injected into the banking system, right? In this case, 9 million in bank reserves into the system, and then you have the collateral provider and take 10 million in treasuries out of the system during the middle of the transaction. So this is the opening leg, okay? Because there's two legs for a repo transaction. You open it and then you close it. So now, upon repurchase, right, because the Fed purchased the treasuries from the collateral provider originally, and now the collateral provider, i.e. the commercial bank, in our case, repurchases them from the Fed. So you see the same 10 million in treasuries goes back to the commercial bank. And then now we have 9.09 million in cash going to the Fed, in this case, the cash investor. This little bit more than 9, this 90 grand, is the interest paid. They are repurchasing the same treasuries, well, the same amount of treasuries, from the Fed at a later date on a higher price. This difference in the repurchase price and the sale price is the interest. That's why it's called a repurchase agreement. So yeah. So that means that this 90 grand is going to the Fed, which means there's not the interest paid on this repo is going out of the commercial banking system. There are fewer bank reserves to begin with than there were in the beginning of the transaction, or beginning of the repo, I should say, right? And so on net balance, after the whole repo, you have bank reserves coming out of the system. From the perspective of collateral, the amount of treasuries doesn't change, right? And so basically you just have that time between the opening of the repo and closing that the treasuries are out of the market, and then they're put back in, right? And so it's kind of a net wash, especially since the vast majority of these repo transactions are done literally overnight. And again, that's in that other post too, where I have a chart showing the difference between all repos and then overnight repos. And overnight repos are like that much lower. So the significant percentage, well, the vast majority of repos are overnight. In that case, it was specifically tri-party repos, I should say, which is the majority of the repo market. Okay, and so now we have reverse repo, which it's the same type of transaction, just the roles are switched. So in this case, the Fed sells a security with the promise to buy it back in the future at a higher price, right? So now the Fed is the seller of the security. So now the Fed is the collateral provider in our graphic up here, right? So now this is the Fed and this is the commercial bank. That's why it's called the reverse repo, because they switched roles. But the same transaction is kind of happening. It's just that the roles are switched. Okay, so basically what's happening now is maybe I should just stay on the graphic. Sorry. At least that's how I think about it. So now the Fed will go up to the main one. So we can see both legs. So now this is the Fed and this is the commercial bank, right? And so now the commercial bank purchases the treasuries from the Fed. So now we have net treasuries into the system, right? Which, here's the kicker, now the commercial banks can rehypothecate those, which is probably what they're doing anyway. And the Fed takes bank reserves out of the system. I think this is where a lot of people, like I've seen some arguments saying that reverse repos with the Fed actually pull bank reserves out of the system, which I think this is where it's coming from, because it's in this opening leg where the bank reserves are actually being pulled out. But again, it's overnight, and then they could just get put back in with interest. And so on the closing of the transaction, there's actually more bank reserves in the system to begin with. And that's if the amount of reverse repos stays constant, right? And I'll comment on that in a minute, because obviously this is not just a nice, pretty world where everything's constant and you just have pretty graphs that actually work. But anyways, try not to get ahead of myself. And so basically what happens, or what can happen, is the Fed sells the treasuries to the commercial bank, who then can rehypothecate those, which means that they can use them as collateral for other loans, because it's called a repurchase agreement, not a loan. And so technically the commercial bank owns those treasuries now, so they can use them as collateral for other loans, whether they be other forms of short-term lending. They could use them in more repos, I'd assume, with other entities, most likely. I don't see a point in them just flipping them back to the Fed when they're just going to do it anyway on the close of the transaction. But yeah. So there's that, and that's pretty much why I think they do the rehypothecation, is because from the perspective of a commercial bank, when you can basically buy those treasuries from the Fed, and then obviously the Fed pays them interest on those bank reserves that they give them, which it's like 25 basis points, or it was. I don't know if they've been changing that interest rate as well, as it probably, because they use it as I think the floor for Fed funds. And so basically when they increased Fed funds recently, and will probably do it again, they would have increased the overnight reverse repo rate. Anyways, so let's see, there's that. They rehypothecate them because they can get a much higher interest rate than 25 basis points by using those treasuries as collateral for other loans. So that's one way where they can basically further financialize everything, the economy, whatever, and make money that way. Okay, so upon closing the reverse repo, the Fed buys back the security at a higher repurchase price, right? Because they're closing that transaction. It's like a trade in a way, where you open it and then you have to have an exit strategy and exit. Anyways, but yeah. So the bank reserves upon the closing of the transaction now go from the Fed with interest back to the commercial bank. So now that commercial bank has more bank reserves on their balance sheet, and those same treasuries go back to the Fed. So on that balance, the treasuries are constant, and however, the amount of bank reserves in the system has increased. And kind of some nuances that come to mind with this, at least for me. One, when I highlighted this in green just to kind of remind myself that I should probably change my wording here, because technically, um, most of the if I remember correctly, most of the transactions with most of the reverse repo transactions with the Fed as a counterparty are tri-party. And so that means that and there's some technicalities in what the collateral can be used for. So like when the Fed would give the treasuries to um, the commercial bank, they technically, like, they can't rehypothecate them, because technically they're in kind of like an escrow in a way with the clearinghouse. I think I'll have to re-go over that. I'm in the middle of reading a nice staff report from the New York Fed that goes a lot more in depth to it. I actually cited the thing, I believe. Yeah, I think it's this one. It's like, I forget the whole title, but this is the one that I've been using, and it's really helpful. It's like a reference guide to repo and other short-term lending or something. It's from the New York Fed. Um, I don't remember the exact title, but it's definitely worth a read, and it's been helpful. But the reason I highlighted this in green, because I said it now would, or I probably should have said it now would go back to the Fed, because again, I did this whole post with the whole premise of this post is just to get the general concept, which is why I'm using bilateral repo for a diagram, just so you can kind of, it's easier to see, like, okay, where's cash going, where's collateral going, and kind of see that cycle through the agreements and try to get a better understanding. Some more nuance is the reserve requirement is 0%, and so it doesn't really matter if the banks have bank reserves or increase bank reserves by this minuscule interest payment that they get. Doesn't really matter, because you can argue that they really don't need bank reserves. Also, for the simple fact of, by the Fed's own definition, they're currently operating in an ample reserves regime, which I made another post about, which is, click here in the caps. Just because I think it's interesting to see how they changed, and how basically the whole premise of an ample, and how they define an ample amount of reserves, is like a significant fluctuation in the amount of bank reserves in the system does not affect Fed funds, right? And so this was going on to probably why they changed from IOER, which is interest on excess reserves. They also had IORR, which is interest on required reserves. And I did a post on this as well, which is basically like, they used to have two separate rates, where you had interest on required reserves, obviously with a non-zero reserve requirement, and then they had interest on excess reserves, which is all the reserves the banks held excess to that requirement. But they ended up having the rates, and I actually made an Excel graph taking the difference between the two rates that they give. You can just find that on the St. Louis Fed website, the IOER and IORR. Sorry. For some reason, when I speak acronyms fast, sometimes I mix up the letters. But anyways, so they were the same for the vast majority of the time. And so in like 2018, I don't know. But in the past few years, they just combined them to IORB, interest on reserve balances, and just give them interest on all of the reserves, period. Because one, the two different rates originally, excess and required, were the same. And two, so with the reserve requirement to be zero, there are no required reserves by definition. And so I'm thinking maybe that's why they call it an ample reserves regime, is because, and also because they don't, I think it might imply that they have absolutely no intention of reinstating a reserve requirement in the near future. I don't know. Definitely things to think about, and hopefully it wasn't too jumbled for you guys. and definitely some nuances to think through on, like, what does this actually matter, right? And stuff like that. Not that the repos don't matter. That's not what I'm saying. That, like, the amount of bank reserves and such in the system. A final note that I alluded to before was with the rate at which these repos happen, right? And so whenever these repos, mostly on the net balance of treasuries and I guess bank reserves as well within the system, but mostly the treasuries because those are used as collateral for a bunch of things. But basically, if the amount of reverse repos increases every night, because if you think about it, they just keep rolling over these repurchase agreements. They're just taking, say, like, we'll just use this example with 10 million out of the system, and then they're putting it back in the next day, and then they take it out and put it back in. But and like on net balance, the market just, I guess, gets used to that kind of decreased supply of, well, I guess in reverse repo would be putting into the market, and so that would be increased supply. But whichever way you want to think about it, but they get used to that new supply if the amount of repos remains constant. But if, like, say, reverse repos are increasing to a significant degree as they have been, and you can find that on the Fed's website, that they've just been like almost parabolic, and I think they leveled off of just above 1 trillion, but I'd have to look at the graph again. And basically it's like they as they're increasing more and more in terms of reverse repos, the market is continuously every day not only getting the original amount rolled over, but getting more put into the market. And so they're like, okay, there's so much collateral everywhere, I'd assume, because with reverse repos, the Fed is putting them into the market. And so during the day, there's more and more treasuries going into the market. I don't know. It's definitely interesting. That's all I got for this one. But looks like we're going to have a whole series of posts about the repo market because I just think it's really interesting. But let's see, I'll stop the screen share. Anyways, so that's all I got for this one. So I hope you guys have a good day, and I will see you on the next one.